Most people assume that if someone rarely leaves the house, something must be wrong. Maybe they're antisocial, maybe they're shy, maybe they're lonely. But what if that assumption says more about society than it does about the person staying home? Some people feel drained after an hour in a crowded room, yet completely alive after a quiet evening alone. Others can spend an entire weekend indoors and feel refreshed instead of trapped. The question is, why? What is happening inside the mind that makes the outside world feel exhausting, while home feels like a refuge? The answer is more complex than most people realize, and by the end of this video, you may never look at this behavior the same way again. Our culture often treats going out as the default. Invitations are considered opportunities. Busy schedules are worn like badges of honor. Someone who is always traveling, socializing, or attending events is often seen as living life to the fullest. So when a person repeatedly chooses to stay home, it's easy to assume they're missing out. But psychology suggests that the real story depends on something far more important than how often someone leaves the house. It depends on what happens inside their mind before, during, and after they step outside. Imagine two coworkers invited to the same weekend party. One spends the day excited, imagining conversations and new experiences. The other spends the same day feeling a growing sense of tension. They haven't even arrived yet, but they're already mentally rehearsing awkward conversations, crowded rooms, loud music, and the exhaustion that will follow. They may still attend, smile, and seem perfectly comfortable. Yet when they finally return home, they feel an overwhelming sense of relief, as if their brain has finally been allowed to relax. From the outside, both people looked identical. Inside, they experienced completely different worlds. One reason for this difference lies in how our brains process stimulation. Every environment sends a constant stream of information through our senses. Lights, voices, movement, unfamiliar faces, traffic, notifications, background music. Our brain has to sort through all of it. Some people naturally tolerate this flood of stimulation better than others. Researchers studying personality have long observed that individuals vary in their preferred level of external stimulation. People who become mentally saturated more quickly often find quiet environments more restorative. Staying home isn't necessarily about avoiding life. Sometimes it's about giving the brain a chance to recover from an environment that constantly demands attention. This is where one of the biggest myths begins to fall apart. Many people confuse solitude with loneliness, but psychology makes an important distinction between the two. Loneliness is the painful feeling of lacking meaningful connection. Solitude, on the other hand, is simply being alone, and for many people, it can be deeply satisfying. A person can feel intensely lonely in a crowded restaurant while feeling completely content spending an evening reading, cooking, or working on a personal project at home. The number of people around you doesn't always determine how connected you feel. The quality of those connections matters much more. Think about the last time you had a conversation that felt forced. You searched for things to say, laughed politely, checked your phone, and counted the minutes until you could leave. Now compare that to spending 2 uninterrupted hours doing something you genuinely enjoy. Maybe you learned a new skill, organized your room, watched a fascinating documentary, or simply sat quietly with your thoughts. One experience left you emotionally depleted. The other left you feeling unexpectedly peaceful. That contrast reveals something important. Our minds aren't just seeking activity, they're seeking environments that match our psychological needs. Modern neuroscience also offers an interesting clue. The brain never truly switches off. Even during quiet moments, a network of regions known as the default mode network becomes active. This network is involved in reflecting on the past, imagining the future, understanding ourselves, and making sense of our experiences. While researchers are still exploring exactly how this system works, periods of uninterrupted quiet appear to give many people the mental space to process emotions, organize memories, and solve problems in ways that constant stimulation often interrupts. Home can become the place where this internal work finally has room to happen, but here's where things become even more surprising. Sometimes the desire to stay home has very little to do with comfort and much more to do with predictability. Human brains are prediction machines. Every day, they constantly try to anticipate what will happen next, because predictable situations require less mental effort. Home is one of the most predictable environments we experience. We know where everything is. We know the sounds, the routines, the expectations. Outside, every interaction introduces uncertainty. Will the traffic be stressful? Will the conversation become uncomfortable? Will plans suddenly change? Even when none of those things actually happen, the brain still prepares for them. For some people, that preparation itself becomes mentally exhausting. This doesn't mean everyone who enjoys staying home is anxious or fearful. In fact, many aren't. They simply find greater satisfaction in activities that don't depend on constant external excitement. Reading, creating art, exercising, gardening, learning, gaming with close friends, writing or spending time with family can provide a deep sense of meaning without ever requiring a crowded social calendar. Behavioral psychology reminds us that people naturally repeat behaviors that consistently feel rewarding. If home repeatedly becomes the place where someone feels calm, creative, and emotionally balanced, it's only natural that their brain begins preferring it over environments that leave them overstimulated. Yet there's another layer that many people never consider, and it explains why two people can spend the same amount of time at home for completely different psychological reasons. One person stays because home is where they flourish. Another stays because leaving has quietly started to feel harder than it should. From the outside, the behavior looks identical, but inside the mind, the story couldn't be more different. This is where psychology asks an important question. Is staying home a choice, or has it slowly become a habit that now feels automatic? The answer isn't always obvious, even to the person experiencing it. Habits form because the brain is remarkably efficient. When a behavior consistently leads to a positive outcome, or helps us avoid something unpleasant, the brain begins to favor it. Over time, that choice requires less conscious thought. If every evening spent at home brings relaxation, while every crowded outing ends in exhaustion, the mind starts creating a simple association. Home equals peace, outside equals effort. That doesn't mean the outside world is dangerous. It means the brain has learned which environment feels more rewarding. Behavioral psychologists call this reinforcement. When a behavior is followed by relief, comfort, or satisfaction, we're more likely to repeat it. Imagine someone who declines one social invitation because they're tired after a demanding week. They spend the evening resting, wake up feeling refreshed, and think, "I'm glad I stayed home." A week later, another invitation arrives. Again, staying home feels easier. Months pass, and without realizing it, saying no has become the default. This isn't necessarily unhealthy. It only becomes a concern if the decision is no longer based on preference, but on fear, or the belief that the outside world has nothing meaningful to offer. That's why context matters so much. Psychology rarely judges a behavior in isolation. Instead, it asks what purpose the behavior serves. Someone who enjoys a peaceful weekend indoors but happily attends a close friend's wedding, visits family, or explores a new city when they genuinely want to, is making flexible choices. Their home is a sanctuary, not a prison. Flexibility is often a sign of psychological well-being. When we can adapt our behavior to different situations without feeling trapped by one pattern, we usually experience greater resilience. Interestingly, many people who love staying home aren't avoiding people altogether. They're avoiding superficial interactions. Social psychology has repeatedly shown that humans don't simply crave more relationships. They crave meaningful ones. Think about the difference between spending 3 hours making small talk with strangers and spending 30 minutes in a heartfelt conversation with someone who truly understands you. The emotional impact is completely different. A person who values depth over quantity may appear unsociable to others, but in reality, they're being selective about where they invest their emotional energy. There's another misconception worth challenging. We often assume that excitement always leads to happiness, but research on well-being paints a more nuanced picture. Happiness isn't only found in thrilling experiences or packed schedules. For many people, it's found in a sense of autonomy, the feeling that they're choosing how to spend their time rather than constantly reacting to other people's expectations. If staying home allows someone to read, build something, care for loved ones, pursue a hobby, or simply enjoy a slower pace of life, that choice can support genuine well-being rather than diminish it. At the same time, it's important not to romanticize staying home as inherently superior. Human beings are social creatures. Even people who deeply value solitude usually benefit from meaningful connection. Decades of psychological research suggest that strong relationships are among the most reliable predictors of long-term well-being. The key isn't surrounding yourself with as many people as possible. It's maintaining connections that make you feel understood, respected, and accepted. A quiet life doesn't have to be a lonely life. There's also an interesting paradox. The more comfortable home becomes, the easier it is to overlook the subtle ways the outside world helps us grow. New environments challenge our assumptions. Unexpected conversations expose us to different perspectives. Solving unfamiliar problems builds confidence. Even small experiences, trying a new cafe, taking a different route to work, or speaking with someone from a different background, can strengthen cognitive flexibility, the brain's ability to adapt to new situations. Growth often happens just beyond the edge of our routines. Think about learning to ride a bicycle. The first few attempts feel awkward because your brain is building new neural pathways. Eventually, what once required intense concentration becomes automatic. Social experiences work in a similar way. If we gradually stop exposing ourselves to certain situations, they can begin to feel more unfamiliar than they really are. On the other hand, approaching them at a comfortable pace can rebuild confidence over time. The goal isn't to force yourself into constant social activity. It's to avoid letting comfort quietly shrink your world. Perhaps the most surprising insight is this. The desire to stay home often reflects how someone manages their energy, not how much they value other people. We tend to judge behavior by what we can see. Someone declines invitations, leaves gatherings early, or chooses a quiet evening instead of a busy night out, and we assume they're uninterested or distant. But internally, they may care deeply about the people in their lives. They're simply protecting the mental and emotional resources they need to be fully present when those moments truly matter. This is why labels can be misleading. Words like antisocial, boring, or reclusive flatten a complex human experience into a simple stereotype. Psychology encourages us to ask better questions instead. Is this person restoring themselves? Are they pursuing meaningful activities? Are they maintaining the relationships that matter most? Or are they withdrawing because fear, hopelessness, or overwhelming stress has narrowed their world? The behavior may look similar, but the underlying psychology can be completely different. In the end, whether someone loves staying home isn't the most interesting question. The more revealing question is why. Are they escaping life, or are they creating a life that genuinely fits who they are? The healthiest answer isn't found at either extreme. A fulfilling life usually includes both the peace of solitude and the richness of meaningful connection. Knowing when to seek one and when to embrace the other is a skill that many people spend years learning. So the next time you meet someone who rarely wants to leave the house, resist the urge to make quick assumptions. They might be overwhelmed by constant stimulation. They might recharge through quiet reflection. They might simply find joy in a slower, more intentional way of living. Or they may be facing challenges that aren't visible from the outside. Human behavior almost always has a deeper story than first impressions suggest. And perhaps that's the real lesson. The places we choose to spend our time often reveal less about how social we are, and more about where our minds feel most at peace. The challenge isn't to become someone who is always out or always in. It's to build a life where your choices come from understanding yourself, rather than from habit, pressure, or fear. If you enjoy exploring the hidden psychology behind everyday human behavior, consider subscribing to PsycheLens. And before you move on to the next video, ask yourself one simple question. When you choose to stay home, Are you moving closer to the life you truly want, or simply staying where your mind has become most comfortable?